Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where we are now in our third season of helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchuk, dietitian, running coach, twin mom, and fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchuk Performance Nutrition, I've spent over a decade helping runners learn to fuel their bodies better, unlock their best running performances, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. This podcast is all about helping you become the very best runner you can be by teaching you the running-specific nutrition, training, and recovery strategies that you need to reach all your wildest health, fitness, and running goals. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, join me each week as I share my best advice, interview guest experts, and talk to everyday runners who are conquering their goals by tapping into the power of performance nutrition, with a side of some myth busting too. And if you're looking for even more tips, resources, and strategies for runners, you can find me on Instagram at Steph the Runner's Dietitian or by visiting www.stephanienatchuk.com. All right, let's dive into today's episode. Start today's episode, I just want to really quickly invite you to download my free fueling guide and strength training guides for runners. Currently available as a handy little bundle for you all in one at the link in the show notes. So just to give you more information, in this free fueling guide, you're going to find my top fueling tips for runners. As well, in there, I've put together some meal ideas and even a couple of recipes for your pre and post run fuel. We've also got some suggestions for what to fuel with during your run to make sure that you just have the best overall performance possible. If you've really been struggling to understand what to eat, when, where to start when it comes to supporting your running with better nutrition, this guide is here to help you kickstart your running journey. The other guide that I mentioned is my strength training guide for runners. We know that runners are notoriously bad at consistently getting their strength training in. So this guide includes both a PDF resource, it's got some tips, some guidelines, as well as a link to my series on YouTube where I walk you through all the exercises in this program, giving you some suggestions on proper form, how to modify if needed, how to progress things if needed. This is a really great beginner's guide to strength training for runners who want an effective but efficient full body workout that is going to support the key muscles and movements you need to run stronger and help stay injury free. So once again, both of these guides are available as a handy little bundle. So you just click on the link in the show notes, enter your email address once, and both of the free guides are going to get sent to your inbox right away. I really hope that you find these guides helpful and that they support you and your running goals in the most effective way possible. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where I am very excited to bring you this fantastic Q&A episode, which is our first Q&A episode of season 3, and we have got some fantastic questions to answer. These were all submitted by my Instagram followers at Steph the Runner's Dietitian. So if you aren't already following me on Instagram, we aren't connected over there, then definitely go check it out. And, on there, I share a lot of content, tips, fueling strategies, all kinds of things to do with running. But of course, if you want an opportunity to submit a question for our next Q&A episodes that we'll do this year, then that is your chance. And just keep an eye out for when I put the call out for needing some questions submitted. So like I said, I'm really, really excited about the questions that came in for this one. Some great topics that I'll answer as, kind of succinctly as possible today, but they might warrant maybe a more in-depth episode all on their own. So our first question for today is about looking at carb loading versus race day fueling. So this question came in, somebody asking, what is the purpose of carb loading if we are taking gels during a marathon. So why bother with the whole carb loading process, right? And generally for a marathon, we're looking at like a 2 to 3 day carb load leading up to our race. So what is the purpose of that if we're also taking in gels and we're expected to be taking in like 60 plus grams of carbs per hour during a marathon? And so really, there are two different goals going on here, two different reasons why we carb load and why we would take in intra race nutrition. And so that could be gels, of course, or it might be, your energy chews, or it might be your fruit bars, or it might be candy or a sports drink, or like whatever you're using for intra run fueling. So if I refer to like a gel throughout this discussion, just know that I mean any intra run fueling that you may take in. It's not just specific to a gel. So the purpose of carb loading, the reason why we carb load, is because we are trying to maximize our body's muscle glycogen stores. Now, glycogen is the type of carbohydrate that we store in our muscles that we use for energy when we run. Now, depending on how fast we're running, the intensity of that run, we have a varying degree of reliance on carbohydrate for a primary energy source. So when we are at a much lower intensity, a much easier effort, at that point we are using more fat as a fuel source. But of course, that doesn't mean we have zero reliance on carbohydrates. We are not only using fat as a fuel source, we just have more of a reliance on fat, right? The gear has shifted a little bit to burning a little bit more fat as a percentage versus carbs. Now, the faster we run, so the more intense that effort, the higher that effort, the more reliance we have on carbohydrates for energy. So if we're talking about a scenario where you're racing as hard as you can, right? You're running as fast as you can, or even just like marathon pace, right? Yes, you are aerobic and you are burning a large proportion of those calories as fat, but over the course of 26.2 miles, we are still looking at, thousands of calories required in carbohydrates as well. So remember that fueling and what fueling system we are using is never all or nothing. We're never 100% carb or 100% that. We're always a mix. And over the course of a marathon, we are going to be relying very heavily on both of these systems to be optimized, right? Because 26.2 miles, that's long, right? That's a long ass run. So carb loading, that 2 to 3 day carb load that we do prior to a marathon, is helping to ensure that we are going into that race with as much muscle glycogen as possible. Again, so that we have more gas in the tank, more fuel available to us for that full duration. And so getting closer to the end, we can pick up our pace a little bit. We can up that intensity, right? We're not bonking, hitting the wall, really losing steam, maybe around that like 16, 18, 20, whatever, mile mark, that we're just simply running out of gas. So we want to go into that run as well fueled as possible. Now, on the other hand, somebody might think, well, I'm just going to take my intra-run fuel, right? I'm just going to take gels along the way. So why do I need to carb load if I'm just going to be taking these gels? Now, for your marathon intra-run fueling plan, depending on the duration, like depending on how long it takes you to run that marathon, you're looking at wanting to get in like 60, maybe 90 grams of carbs per hour, right? So let's say we'll just use 60 as kind of our average here, 60 grams of carbs per hour. Well, that's only 240 calories. Now, the reason that we're not taking in more is primarily because the human digestive system only has an ability to absorb so much fuel in a short period of time. So 60 grams of carbs per hour, we can work our way up to training our gut to be able to do that. 90 grams of carbs per hour, again, it can be done, but we need, pretty intense gut training, practicing with fueling with progressively more carbohydrates in order to get us to that place where we can take that in as we are also running. And so, the ability for the human digestive tract to take in calories and to absorb calories is not endless. So if we look mathematically speaking at how many calories we are burning per hour of that marathon versus how many calories we can take in, there's a gap. There's a big gap. So 60 grams of carbohydrates in the form of like gels or a sports drink, you're looking at 240 calories per hour, right? So 60 grams of carbs per hour. Each gram of carbs has 4 calories, 240 calories per hour. Well, when we run, we are burning a minimum of like 600 calories per hour of running, right? Again, it depends on body size, depends on pace, right? There's a lot of factors, but you're looking at burning 600 plus calories per hour of running. So if you're taking in 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, you are not even at 50% of the calories that you are burning per hour of running. So again, progressively as that race goes on, you're going to be depleting your glycogen stores, especially if you haven't carb loaded, you might have pretty minimal glycogen stores to begin with. And the fuel that you're taking in during is just not going to be enough to sustain you, especially at a harder effort. Now, of course, the other thing when we're looking at performance during the marathon and wanting to be able to optimize our performance is the fact that the brain is in a constant state of checking in and monitoring things like muscle glycogen levels and, of course, any fuel that is coming in. So the brain will start to sense this dramatic drop in muscle glycogen. And if we don't have some fuel coming in to basically tell the brain, like, hey, it's okay. Like, we're not going to run out of gas. We got lots of fuel. Everything's fine. You can keep going. The brain is going to start to send out those danger signals, right? Increase in feelings of fatigue. Hey, you should start slowing down. This is getting really hard. Maybe it's time to take a break. I don't think you can do this. This doesn't feel safe. The brain is going to start to send out those signals telling us to slow down far before we actually get ourselves into trouble with low muscle glycogen stores. The brain is trying to protect us and preserve and survive. And so if it sees, okay, if you keep running at this pace endlessly, right, you're going to run out of fuel and you're going to die, right? We know that isn't the case, but the brain is perceiving it as this dangerous situation. And so we start to get those intense feelings of needing to slow down, needing to stop, even though physically we could probably make it to the end and we could probably get through. So both carb loading, right, sets us up for success by having the most possible gas in the tank. Supplementing with the intra-run fuel is both, giving us that additional energy source, which is going to spare muscle glycogen, right? Not cause us to go through muscle glycogen as quickly, which is going to then allow the brain to feel more confident in our ability to complete this run because we are getting in that energy source. Yes, we're burning muscle glycogen, those stores are dropping, but we have supplemental fuel coming in, so everything's good, everything's fine. Which is another reason why, this is a bit off topic, but another reason why we want to start our fueling process during our runs and races early, right? Don't wait until you get into trouble. Don't wait until you feel like you're running out of gas. Don't wait until you start to feel fatigued and like you have to stop and take a break before you start to get in that supplemental fuel, right? We want to fuel early. We want to fuel often, so that physiologically we have enough energy, but also psychologically we're more able to push through the demands of running a marathon. So that's question number one. Again, I think this is a really, really good one because I think a lot of people probably wonder, they probably think they should be doing kind of either or. But in reality, if we really want our best possible performance, then both is going to be the way to go. Our second question is kind of a little bit of a piggyback off of that one. And again, a really, really good question. I think this often blows a lot of runners' minds. So this person said, the body needs 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour for running a marathon. If we're looking at a gel, that's about 25 grams of carbohydrates per gel. Do I really need to take 15 to 18 gels in a 5-hour marathon? And the answer to that is yes. Now, I did not double check this person's specific math on that one. So I don't know if the correct number is in fact 15 to 18, but I assume that we're at least in the ballpark here. Yes. And I know it's crazy, right? It sounds like so much, and it's probably double, if not triple, what you might have imagined or what you might have currently been fueling with. And honestly, in the years and years that I've been working with runners, the vast majority of the time, for the runners that I work with who come into working with me thinking that they're doing a pretty good job of fueling, maybe not perfect, maybe not optimal, but they are fueling during their workouts and races. They have trained with stuff, they use gels, coming into this coaching process. It is not unheard of for us to still need to double their intra-run fuel intake and probably do some carb loading and at least double their carb loading efforts. Now, of course, I have a ton of clients that I work with who come into working with me who are doing no fueling, right? No pre-workout, maybe a gel here or there they've tried in the past, but not had a great experience. So kind of left those alone. Some people are doing like minimal to zero fueling coming in, but the people who think that they're doing pretty good as a starting point, it's not unheard of for us to need to double what they're taking in. This 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour is a lot, and it requires a lot of planning, a lot of training with different things, figuring out what works for you. But the nice thing is that it does not need to be necessarily 15 to 18 gels over the course of a marathon, right? We can supplement what we're getting in from gels with something like a sports drink. So maybe we're not just doing gels and water over the course of that marathon, but we're doing gels and then a sports drink that has carbohydrates. So we potentially could be getting in maybe another like 20, 30 grams of carbs per hour just by drinking some of those carbs along with the gels that we're taking. So then now maybe we only need, say, like, I don't know, 10 or 12 gels over the course of that marathon, plus what we're getting in from our fluids. It doesn't just need to be all gels. And of course, we can mix it up. We can have some chews, we could have some dried fruit, we can have some candy, all kinds of different things that we can fuel with. But just don't get overwhelmed or bogged down by feeling like it needs to be, upwards of a dozen or more gels. And that's your only option, because it isn't. So yeah, so those are two really good questions about like marathon fueling, intra-run fueling. The next question that I got submitted was someone asking about how fast their paces should be for speed work during their half marathon training plan. And there is no one solid answer to this question, but I wanted to address it because even though I don't have a solid, like specific answer for that individual based on their training plan, I know that a lot of people really struggle with understanding the concept around like intensity and speed work and how fast should I be doing different things. And depending on where you get your training plan from, there may or may not be very clear instructions or very clear details about your paces or effort for a particular workout, or you may not know what that pace is supposed to be for you. So when that, workout says, that training plan that you've got, that workout says you should be doing XYZ intervals at your 5K pace. You may not know what your 5K pace is necessarily, or your 10K pace, or your 1 mile pace, or marathon pace if you haven't run a marathon before, that kind of thing. So that's where it can get a little bit confusing. And so, we want to think about paces and intensity for workouts like when we're shifting gears on a car, right? We've got our easy pace, and that's going to be like our first gear. And then we've got like a little bit faster than that, a little bit faster than that, a little bit faster than that, a little bit faster than that. We can think about maybe having like 5 gears on our car. So we've got like our first gear, our second gear is going to be maybe like marathon pace to half marathon pace. Third gear can be like marathon pace up to lactate threshold, a lactate threshold up to like VO2 max. And we've got like our all out sprint pace. This is just me. Other coaches, other running platforms will probably have a slightly different way of breaking this down. This is not like based in that, but I'm kind of thinking about it like our heart rate zones as well, right? Like kind of thinking about like heart rate zones, effort, and sort of looking at it from that perspective. Now you can do, and I think it's a great idea to do a lot of your training based on effort versus trying to aim for a specific pace that you're looking to accomplish. And the reason is because depending on the day, depending on the workout that you had yesterday, whether it was a rest day or a run day, depending on outside factors like, temperature, environment, how recovered you are, if it's a high volume week or a deload week, or, all these other things that can be happening in your life outside of running, that pace might feel very different on different days. And so I think there is sometimes a case to be made for like just sort of buckling down and letting all that other stuff go and like doing what the training plan says to do pace wise. But a lot of the time, the majority of the time, we do need to adjust sometimes our effort and therefore our paces based on, how things are going, how we're feeling, what's going on that day. So we want to think about, if we're doing, say, repeats or spending some time during a workout at like marathon or half marathon pace, right? That's just usually going to be a little bit faster than our easy running pace. For people who are very experienced half marathoners, that half marathon pace might put you closer to your lactate threshold pace. It's going to be a little bit faster than marathon. But for a lot of people, both half marathon and marathon pace might be fairly similar. And they're going to be just a little bit harder than your easy effort, right? They're kind of, that second, third gear that I was talking about. Then we've got, if you're doing a tempo run where you're spending a little bit more intensity, but a little bit shorter. So maybe those are going to be like a few kilometers to a few miles at a time at that tempo pace. That generally is going to be your lactate threshold pace, and lactate threshold is kind of what we're looking at developing there. And that can be anything from maybe like 10K pace up to about your half marathon pace. Again, it depends on what your training plan says, but it's going to be a little bit faster, and you're going to be doing a little bit of a shorter duration than probably what you're going to do for like a half marathon or marathon workout, right? Like during a long run, you're spending some time at marathon pace, that kind of thing. And of course, certainly a little bit faster than your easy pace, your conversational pace. Then we've got your intervals or your repeats. And that might be, a type of workout where you're doing shorter intervals like 1 mile, 800 meters, 400 meters, 500 meters, that kind of thing. We're doing shorter but faster repeats here. And those ones might be something like you might see your 5K pace in that. Or it might be, a shorter, faster interval of just the fastest pace that you can maintain, getting into that kind of all out VO2 max or faster type of effort level. So to kind of summarize, it depends on your training plan. And if you have questions about how fast should I be doing this, then it's always best to go back to, the person or the platform or where you got that training plan from and just ask for some clarification. Because sometimes it just comes down to when you're actually looking at and like reading the training plan, sometimes it's just a matter of like maybe not understanding the terminology that's there. There's like sometimes a legend somewhere like over here that you're like, oh, okay, now I understand what like all these like letters and kind of random kind of short form things mean. Or it might require you to use an online calculator, an online tool to look at, okay, if this is my most recent 10K pace, maybe I ran a 10K recently, I'm going to put that into this online calculator, and then it's going to spit out for me what my 5K pace would be based on that 10K pace, or like my 1 mile pace. It's going to tell me what is my estimated 1 mile pace based on that 10K race time, or what would be my marathon pace if you don't have like a goal time already in mind. So you can use a recent race time to put that into an online calculator, and then it will give you what those paces should be. And that can be a really handy way of looking at this as well. Or if you prefer to kind of run more so by effort versus being really kind of tuned in and dialed into your paces, then that's definitely an option as well. But at the end of the day, if you have questions about what is in your training plan, go back to where you got that training plan from and get the clarification you need. And if you're not getting a good answer, if it's maybe just like a free plan that you got online, if it's coming from a place like maybe one of the apps these days, like there's a lot of apps and programs that are using like AI and stuff to generate training plans. And I don't know if you would get a clear answer on some of that, then this is where working with a coach can be really beneficial to talk about your goals, talk about where your kind of weak points are with running, and to create a training plan that is just for you and personalized for you based on what you're looking to achieve. Because if you are doing, certain things way too easy, other things way too hard, you're spending too much time at marathon pace versus in your easy zone. If you're not running fast enough on those lactate threshold runs, you're not getting the benefit of what you're trying to do. And that can leave you struggling when it comes to achieving your running goals. So I hope that helps and kind of, gives you some clarification of what you might be looking at with trying to balance out, trying to figure out like how fast am I supposed to be doing these? The next question that we got here is another really good one about, different methods, how to carry fluids with you on a run. So this individual, asked about best way to carry fluids and kind of specifically mentioned that they haven't really found success with using like running belts, running vests, etc. And I will say that there is no perfect method here. There is no one size fits all. Some people love their running belt. They've been using it for years, very comfortable, have no issues with the running belt. Other people don't like the running belt. I am one of those people. I have yet to be successful with a running belt, but I don't mind using like a hydration pack, or even I'll just run with a bottle in my hand. That doesn't bother me at all. And I know a lot of people might think that that sounds absolutely nuts that I do that, but I don't mind it. And I've done it for so many years that it just doesn't bother me. It's just, just part of the way I run. I can run holding a bottle. And I know for a lot of people that would just like never ever happen. They need somewhere to put something. And to that, that kind of brings up the more important point of you will get comfortable doing whatever you practice with. So whether it's a vest or like a handheld, like they make ones that you don't just hold the bottle, but like it's got a little Velcro thing that like goes around your hand. So it's like a handheld, but you don't have to actually like hold it. Cause like, yeah, sometimes I will get a thumb cramp on a long run. Or maybe it's a pack or a vest or belt or like whatever it is. But you need something, like you need some way of being able to get in enough fluids and maintain your hydration during these runs. So it's really not an option to just say, well, this just doesn't work for me. It's kind of like the intra-run fueling, right? We need to practice. We need to get comfortable with it. We need to figure out the logistics. We need to try different things, figure out what we like, what we don't like. And eventually we will get used to it, get accustomed to it, and it will just become second nature to us. But outside of that, if a lot of your running is taking place, like if you're going to be doing a lot of like supported races where you don't really need to bring a lot of stuff with you, because like every mile or two, there's going to be a hydration station and aid station set up along the run. And so you're not too worried about like having that stuff with you. It's just more of a matter of like training runs. A couple of things that you can do. The first is to actually like go out before you go for your run and like put bottles along the path, like set up little hydration stations for yourself along the way, or run in a loop and have like your little personal aid station set up kind of in a central location. It could be your car, it could be your house, wherever. But put something there so that you're running back to that spot and you can, go ahead and fuel and hydrate, maybe every like 30 or 45 minutes or so as you're going. Now, I do want you practicing what you're going to do on race day as much as possible during the event. So you might have to switch it up a little bit and kind of make these stations every couple of miles and get creative with it. But to set up a situation where you can be as close to the race day environment as possible. If you are like hard and fast, absolutely no, Steph, I will not carry something. But like I said, with more practice, it does get a lot easier to make it work for you if you just kind of plan ahead and just try different things and figure out what you like. All right. So our next question here is around carbohydrate consumption and distance running and risk for type 2 diabetes. And this is such a good question that a lot of you have probably had, a lot of you have probably wondered about. And I think it's a really important question to address. So this Instagram follower asked, are long distance runners at a higher risk of type 2 diabetes due to carbohydrate consumption? And with the popularity, I think it's sort of waning now. Maybe, I don't know, the low carb kind of trend in the diet world comes and goes. The fasted training trends kind of come and go. We've seen that just in a cyclical sort of fashion over the years. And it brings up a lot of concerns, fears. People are worried about, oh, if I'm taking like all these gels, all these sports, I'm eating all these carbs, my dietitian says I got to be like getting half a plate of carbs in. Like, isn't that going to cause me to develop type 2 diabetes? And what's fascinating is that the opposite is actually true. Now, I'm not saying that, excess carbohydrate consumption, large amounts of carbohydrate consumption has no connection whatsoever to the development of type 2 diabetes, but endurance runners specifically, athletes, more active people actually are at a reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. And again, this is not based on, whether or not they're consuming carbohydrates. And this is really fascinating. And I think the fact that this question gets brought up so often and why we're continuously having this discussion or seeing this discussed, amongst professionals on podcasts, like people who are selling different dietary strategies or promoting different dietary strategies, I think a lot of times it really does come down to just a misunderstanding about how type 2 diabetes develops in the body and that there are multiple factors at play. And the fact that carbohydrate consumption is not the direct link to developing type 2 diabetes that we are sort of told it is, or that it's sort of often um, sort of implicated that it is. So what we need to understand is that the connection between eating carbohydrates and developing type 2 diabetes is not a direct link. And that is to say that in somebody who does not have diabetes, when we eat more carbohydrates, we do not see a direct outcome of high blood sugars, therefore somebody having diabetes, right? Because type 2 diabetes is when the body is unable to maintain healthy blood sugar levels. And there's a lot of different reasons why this happens. And so it's actually happening. And this is in the majority of cases. Not everyone who has type 2 diabetes is this going to be the case for them, because there's a number of subtypes of type 2 diabetes. So we have type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disorder where the body makes no insulin at all. Then we have type 2 diabetes, which used to be thought of as adult onset diabetes, but now we have sort of shifted that language to being type 2 diabetes. And within type 2 diabetes, we can have a number of different ways that a person can present. And so what that means is that there are different things physiologically that can be going on that causes that person to have high blood sugars, which is the diagnostic criteria for type 2 diabetes. So when I talk about carbohydrates and I talk about visceral fat and body weight and the way that insulin plays a role in getting getting the glucose into our cells, and how that might not be functioning properly for these different reasons. I'm talking about like a large proportion of the people who get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but certainly not every single person, because there are different subtypes that a person can present with. So if you're listening and what I'm sharing here is not your story, or maybe it's not the story of someone else that you've heard or a family member, just know that I'm talking about sort of the majority of cases here, but certainly this does not encompass every single person, because it is like most chronic conditions, there are so many different disease states that we can have that, like, it's not one size fits all, right? Everyone's situation, everyone's story is not going to be exactly the same. But for the people that I'm talking about here, for this kind of specific situation, this is a situation where lifestyle factors, things like our diet and exercise habits, can play a role in our risk and are going to contribute, right? Because there are people who are very active, eat very well, do not have an excess in body fat or visceral fat, and still, because of their insulin production, and this of course comes down to things like aging and genetics, may still wind up with type 2 diabetes. And so, we want to do as much as we can to live a healthy lifestyle. We want to do as much as we can to stay active, to eat well, control what we can in our lifestyle to reduce our risk, but just knowing that that is not going to prevent 100% of cases of type 2 diabetes. So, what is actually happening when someone does develop type 2 diabetes? And again, talking about these specific individuals, the majority of cases, right? We see an excess of calories being consumed beyond what our bodies need for energy. And this is not just carbohydrate calories, right? Like, this is not just a situation where somebody is eating too much candy, drinking too much pop, eating too much pasta, right? Like, it's not just carbohydrate calories that influence our body's ability to gain weight, or of course, our ability to metabolize and use the calories from the food that we eat, right? So this could be an excess of calories being consumed from carbohydrates. It could be fat calories. It could be protein calories. That, of course, is a little bit more challenging to overeat on without an addition, without also having to, excess fat or carbohydrate calories potentially being taken in. Or, the one a lot of people aren't maybe thinking about or aren't really aware of is alcohol calories, right? We have our primary macronutrients. We have carbohydrates, fats, and protein that are the main places that we get calories in our diet. But alcohol is actually another major one. And alcohol has almost as many calories per gram as fat. So alcohol, and if we are consuming a lot of alcohol on a frequent basis, I mean, that alone can be contributing to excess calories being taken in more than our body's requirements, which over time can lead to weight gain. And so this excess causes the body to experience an increase in, of course, body fat percentage, and visceral fat, which is the fat in and around our internal organs. And so what happens here is that we are seeing disruptions in our metabolic functioning because of this excess that we're consuming. And so here is where we see things like insulin resistance, which is basically where the body's energy stores, the body's storage of glucose, which is muscle glycogen, is full. Right. And so we can't take on any more. The muscle cells are full. We have enough energy. We have enough energy stored. And so we begin to see the body become resistant to insulin and insulin not working as well because we have enough. We're full. And so again, this is where that excess glucose that we're consuming, rather than it being stored as muscle glycogen because we don't need any more, right? If we're not burning it off consistently as athletes, then we're seeing that, of course, be turned into body fat and being stored as body fat over time. Now, this is not something that is happening with like one meal. If we have one meal or one day or one weekend, or we go on vacation, or like we have this little short period of time in our lives where we are consuming more calories than we need, or if we're carb loading for a race, right? And we're meeting our requirement of that 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilo for a couple days before a race, right? We're trying to maximize our body's muscle glycogen stores and really, boost our muscle glycogen stores as much as possible. That for that short period of time is not going to cause us to become insulin resistant and trigger the development of type 2 diabetes, right? We're talking about something that is happening over many, many years and decades of just slowly putting that demand, that increased stress on the body to produce more and more and more insulin in order to continue to get that sugar into the body's cells. And it's just this consistent excess over many, many years. And again, I'm talking about the majority of sort of lifestyle-based cases that we see of type 2 diabetes. And so the high blood sugars that are a result of this excess over time, that's just a symptom of really the larger issue of insulin resistance, which comes back down to that physiology of the high levels of body fat, visceral fat, and of course, too many calories from any source being consumed. Now, for people who are, I would say, sort of more critical of the advice of increasing carbohydrate consumption for people who are, distance runners or any type of athlete, people who are critical of that would say, well, the easiest way to reduce your calories and to not put in calories that require insulin to be released and therefore help with, reduced insulin levels in the body, the easiest way to do that is just to cut carbs. And of course, yeah, like fair, like that's a fair criticism of this whole concept. But just simply removing the carbohydrates from the diet, the weight loss that we would see as a result there is the thing that is improving our insulin sensitivity. So yes, we've reduced our demand for insulin, but it's the weight loss that is improving insulin sensitivity, not just the reduction in carbohydrates being consumed. I hope that was all clear. If it wasn't, if you have questions, if we, need to come back and do another episode on this, I would be, of course, more than happy to and break it down further. But just to kind of give that overview of like what is happening when someone does get type 2 diabetes, or what's happening when a lot of people develop type 2 diabetes, and how it is so much more than just, oh, you consume too much sugar and you just eat too many carbs and your diet's too high in carbs. So yes, that can be sometimes a fast track to reducing blood sugars and to kind of seeing that shift, but we haven't solved the underlying issue of insulin resistance if we think that we can just remove carbs. Yes, those blood sugar numbers come down, which is great, but we have to be thinking more about systemically what is happening in the body and understand how exercise plays a role here. So that's what I want to get into next. Exercise is wonderful. I mean, of course, you'll never hear me say a bad thing about exercise, but exercise is fantastic because exercise is increasing the demand for energy in our muscle cells, right? So that muscle glycogen that we're storing in our body's cells and we're using for energy, if we're using it for energy because we're exercising, then of course we need more. And so what happens then is that our muscle cells are very open, and they're pulling sugar in from the bloodstream, and they're doing that more and more and more, right? So our muscle cells are requiring this glycogen for fuel, especially during high intensity training, right? During those fast workouts, fast speed sessions, stuff like that. Now, the thing is, we are also increasing our ability to store muscle glycogen with training. So the more training we do, the more muscle glycogen our muscle cells are going to be open to even storing in the first place, right? So it's quite the opposite, that simply a high carbohydrate diet in runners is going to increase risk for type 2 diabetes. The training overall is going to increase our demand for carbohydrate, make us much less insulin resistant and more insulin sensitive, which is essentially that insulin can now do its job more effectively. What's also fascinating is that our muscle cells have multiple different types of transporters on them to get glucose into the cell. Not all of them require insulin. So we become more insulin sensitive, but also when we're exercising and post exercise, those other transporters on our cells are opening up and pulling in glucose into the cells to use for energy without the need for insulin at all. So our insulin production, that demand for insulin in our bodies, is reduced, which just reduces the stress and the fatigue that we can put on our pancreas. And again, if you imagine that over time, the pancreas, which is the organ that we have that produces our insulin, if that pancreas over many years is being pushed to make more insulin, more insulin, more insulin, more insulin, right? We're becoming more insulin resistant. Therefore, we're producing more insulin over time. Eventually, the pancreas is like, listen, I'm done. I've had enough. I'm exhausted, right? And we push the boundaries of what the pancreas can do, and we push the boundaries of what the pancreas can maintain. Therefore, we start to see that reduction in insulin, which was keeping blood sugars balanced, right? Insulin levels are high, but blood sugars were still okay. Now the pancreas starts to get tired and fatigued, and insulin production is declining. And this is where we see those blood sugars go high. And that's often when people are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. But if we can really think about these lifestyle factors, especially the importance of physical activity and building muscle mass, right? Building muscle mass that uses carbohydrates for energy, that is more metabolically active, then we are just reducing the overall demand on the pancreas over time. And therefore, we're going to get far more, hopefully far more longevity out of this really, really key organ. So runners and athletes, active people, are at a much lower risk for type 2 diabetes due to a number of factors that just physiologically make it easier on their bodies to maintain better blood sugars. And so even though, yes, we do need to consume more carbohydrates as athletes who want to support better performance, it really does come down to these aspects of body composition and having more muscle mass, right? Doing your strength training, not just being the runner who only runs and has very little muscle to speak of, right? We want more muscle, and we want that muscle to be active and using energy so that we can fuel our bodies the way that we need to without seeing disruptions in things like metabolic function. Now, a lot of people have concerns around intra-run fueling specifically, thinking like, oh my gosh, like I shouldn't be taking these gels or drinking these sports drinks. Like they're so high in sugar, like aren't they bad for us? Because we are told, and I tell my clients all the time, like we do need to be mindful of our added sugar consumption at other times of day, right? Specifically in and around your training, before and during your training sessions, these are the times that we want those quick sources of energy, right? We want those simple sugars that are being broken down very rapidly so we can get that energy to our working muscles as fast as possible. Like that's the purpose of sport foods and sport drinks and those types of things. We don't want to be sitting there, eating a gel for supper or sipping on a sports drink before we go to bed at night. I mean, unless we're carb loading, then maybe. But we don't want to be doing those things outside of those times, especially if body composition is something we're looking to shift, because those quick sources of energy don't keep us full. And so we want our general dietary strategy to be looking at high quality carbohydrates, things high in fiber, giving us the nutrients and the fullness and satiety that we need from our meals. But there is a very important role that sport foods and sports drinks play here. those calories are being used for energy immediately, right? They're not causing us harm. They're not increasing our risk for diabetes because we're consuming those things during exercise. They're immediately being used for energy and for fuel, right? They're going directly into our bloodstream, directly into our muscles, and we are burning those calories for energy right away. So they are not causing us to have high blood sugars. The final thing that I want to say here is that, avoiding carbohydrates and avoiding sport foods and, fasting for a lot of our exercise and stuff like that, it can honestly do more harm than good to our performance and ultimately our body composition in the long run than thinking about fueling properly for our training demands. And what I mean by this is and I see this all the time, this is the story of a lot of the clients who come to work with me and come to get help from me because they are struggling, is that we see individuals who are under fueling for their workouts. So they're avoiding eating before training. They are doing a lot of fasted exercise. They are not doing any intra-run fuel. They are maybe not even eating very much afterwards, thinking that that's going to be beneficial for, say, maybe weight loss or getting specific training adaptations. And so what happens then is that because we do need that source of carbohydrates during a workout, even if we are more fat adapted or we're doing a type of workout that is more reliant on our body's fat stores, say those easy long types of runs, even if, yes, those runs are going to be more in the realm of burning more fat and we're adapting to burn a higher proportion of fat as a fuel source during those runs, that does not negate the need for carbohydrates, right? It's not an all or nothing thing. So we still do have some demand for carbohydrates during even our easiest runs. So what that means is that our body is going to start dipping into any glucose that we can get from anywhere. And what we're able to do, our body is very resourceful. I always say our body's liver is actually able to create sugar out of protein. And so it will take muscle protein and start breaking that down in order to get the glucose that we require to continue to exercise and to keep our brain and bodies functioning. So this can be a huge problem over time because I just mentioned the importance of having more muscle, more metabolically active muscle that's using all these calories and demanding all this energy for reducing our risk for type 2 diabetes in the long run. But if you are someone who is consistently, forcing yourself to do a lot of training fasted, eating low carb, like not giving yourself the glucose that you need for performance and not allowing yourself to have the carbohydrates that you need for performance, then what can happen is over time, your body composition gets worse, right? We see a loss of lean muscle, which reduces our need for those carbohydrates for energy. And so again, this is not something that happens like overnight or very quickly. But over time, we see a worsening of body composition, potentially an increase in body fat percentage or even visceral fat storage. And it becomes easier for us to be consuming more calories than what we need. And so, yes, that can pose a problem for long-term health and disease risk. So if we kind of circle back to, the importance of not fearing carbohydrates as a runner, as an athlete, thinking about fast carbs and slow carbs, knowing that there is a time and a place for both in our diet, and there's a very key role that both play in our diet, having an understanding of our unique nutrition needs and the time and the place for making those different choices throughout the day, knowing what our energy demands are, what our carbohydrate, protein, fat requirements are. So we have that personalized strategy to reaching our goals is so, so key. Otherwise, you end up staying stuck in all of this stuff that you hear, right? All of this fear mongering that you hear, all of the, oh, you should train fasted so that you burn more fat and all this kind of stuff that you hear out there. And really just stay stuck and stay struggling. And ultimately, at the end of the day, maybe seeing a worsening in performance, body composition, and health. So I highly, highly recommend that if you have been feeling stuck or if you are struggling with just putting together a nutrition plan that makes sense for you and gets you closer to your goals, just knowing that there are so many resources out there, including the resources that I have available for runners. But I just want you to work with someone. Maybe it's me, maybe I'm kind of, you're feeling like I have the solutions and have the answers to what you've been struggling with. Maybe you don't feel like I do, but whatever it is, I just want you to get help. And I just want you to really feel good during your training, love running, and ultimately be the best athlete and the best version of yourself that you can possibly be. All right. So our last question for today is about looking at adjusting body composition in the off season for your training. So this listener specifically was asking about reducing body fat percentage, which I know a lot of runners are looking at doing and wanting to do over time. So the first thing that I would say is, the pursuit of changing body composition and wanting to reduce body fat percentage, I always think should come with like our eyes fully open and to understand our starting point. So to just say I want to lower body fat percentage because of your a dissatisfaction with maybe how you feel during training, maybe your speed during workouts or races, maybe the way your clothes are fitting, or like some of these other factors, those are important good things to make notes of. But when we say we have a specific metric or measurement that we want to adjust, I think it's very important to go into it having a clear starting point and to have a clear thing that we're able to track and sort of adjust over time, because we want these things to be very objective. How do we know we're on the right track if we're not tracking what we're doing? And so it doesn't need to be that you're going for like a full body composition analysis or that sort of idea. But even just things like looking at a waist measurement can tell us a lot, right? A lot more than even just a weight or looking at the number on the scale, right? Because if we're working on increasing lean muscle mass while we reduce body fat percentage, the change on the scale might be nothing. If over 6 months you build 5 pounds of muscle and you lose 5 pounds of body fat, your weight will be exactly the same, right? You've built 5 pounds of muscle and you lost 5 pounds of body fat. That's fantastic. But the scale is going to say the exact same number as it did at the start. And so I don't want people to want to change their body composition, but still be getting on the scale and then being frustrated the scale maybe isn't changing, right? You can be doing all the right things, but you're not seeing that shift. Is because you're not looking at the right metric. You're not looking at the right measurement for your success. So you can go ahead and get a body composition analysis done. There are lots of places that offer this service. It can be relatively inexpensive depending on the type and where you go. But also something simple like a waist measurement can also be very telling for how body composition is changing over time. But let's say you've had that done, you've got that information, and the next step is to actually make a plan for seeing body composition changes. Again, the off season is a great time to do this when you're in between races and not training as much, rather than it being during a race specific season, especially if you're a marathon runner, where that's your highest training volume. And it can be very, very challenging to balance a calorie deficit with that volume of training. I'm not saying it can't be done. It's just usually not our primary focus and something that really should be seen as like a secondary outcome. And it might just happen kind of organically without us purposefully underfueling. So we have to look at our training volume and adapt our nutrition strategy to our training volume. And this is important to be very, very realistic about how much you are training, right? Because overshooting or undershooting is not going to lead us to get the results that we want, right? Eating too many calories or too few calories, both are equally problematic if we're looking at optimizing and changing body composition. So yes, we do want to be in a small calorie deficit, but we have to base that calorie deficit on a very accurate number of how much energy we need to fuel our training. So we don't want to be, if we're the kind of person who can struggle with consistency and motivation, we don't want to be creating a nutrition plan off of a amount of training that we want to do or we would like to do, but in actuality, we don't do. But on the other hand, we don't want to assume that just because it's our off season, we're doing very, very little training, because there's a lot of people who are generally pretty high volume runners who even in their off season maintain a pretty high base mileage. So we just have to look at what are you doing for your training week by week and adjust accordingly and make it personalized to you. The second very, very key thing here is to make sure that we are focused on getting adequate fiber and adequate protein. These are two nutrients that keep us full. And there's nothing less sustainable when it comes to changing our nutrition, changing our diet, than being hungry, right? Nothing is going to send us into the kitchen eating things that we didn't maybe want to or plan to overeating when the opportunity presents itself than being hungry. So if we really focus on getting enough protein and fiber and keeping ourselves full around with timing our meals around our training, now it makes it easier to not get in excess calories, to stay in that small calorie deficit, because we're not finding ourselves just like ravenously hungry at these random times of day, right? Afternoon, after work, evening time, like those tend to be the most challenging times for a lot of people with their nutrition. And so if we can create a strategy around getting enough protein, getting enough fiber, getting ourselves full and timing our meals around when we're most active throughout the day, now it's much easier to, not overdo it on portion sizes, not overdo it on foods or portions of foods that have a lot of excess added sugars, added fats, or alcohol calories. Again, we want to make sure we're fueling properly for our workouts, before and during our workouts, and that might require some added sugars, some simple sugars. But outside of that, that's where it's, a really great kind of low-hanging fruit to be looking at added sugars from sources at those other times of day. Then look at like frequency and portion sizes of takeout meals, restaurant meals, right? They just tend to be bigger than what we might eat if we cook ourselves. They might be higher in fat calories or higher in sugar, that sort of thing. Just so looking at too, like how often we're eating away from home, and is that actually kind of more than sort of that 80-20 sort of rule that we talk about. Snack foods, desserts, like kind of those extra calories that are outside of our core high protein, high fiber meals, looking at those things first, right? And then, of course, we want to be consistent and we want to be tracking the right things. As I mentioned, making sure that we're not doing all of that and then getting on the scale and being frustrated week after week. The scale isn't changing, even though we've upped our strength training, we've upped our protein and fiber, we're being mindful of some of those extra calories, and we're aiming to be in that small calorie deficit. We've got the plan on the right track, but we're just tracking the wrong thing, right? And so we continually stay frustrated and stuck. So the roadmap might look a little bit different for each person, again, because of how much we're training, what are our goals, how long is our off season. But again, just like I talked about with, understanding your carbohydrate requirements, understanding what you need to be successful with your training and with reducing maybe your risk for type 2 diabetes, if that is a concern for you, working with someone, getting that personalized information just so that you can be confident and reassured that what you're doing is keeping you on the right track. All right. And then we have one more final question for today. And this is another really good one because I think it's incredibly confusing for people to understand. And I'll explain why. The question is, how frequently should you consume fluids during a marathon and at what volume? And what I find is challenging about hydration is that, we have very clear recommendations and guidelines for fueling during marathons, right? So we're looking at 60 plus grams of carbs per hour, right? We can give very clear guidelines on like how often you should be consuming fuel, how much fuel per hour, and make it really simple for people to hit that target. Talk about gut training, that kind of stuff. And then with fluids, it's like, well, you should be drinking. You should have fluids. It's like, well, how much? Well, it depends. And so we don't have a very a recommendation to say, okay, if you're running a marathon, you should be drinking XYZ ounces or milliliters every hour or something like that. And the reason is because we all have a very personalized and different sweat loss rate. So the amount of fluid you need to be taking in depends on how much you're sweating. What are your sweat loss rates? Your sweat loss rates depend on a lot of factors, right? Especially the external environment. And you know this, right? If you run on a day that is, pretty mild, it's like kind of on the cool side, it's not humid, right? You probably don't feel all that thirsty and you probably don't sweat that much. But on a day that it's really hot, really humid, right? You are super thirsty and you get home and you are just drenched in sweat, right? Your sweat loss rates between those two runs are going to be really, really different. And so between your whole training cycle and the day of your marathon, again, the weather, the environment can be very different. So there's a ton of variables and a lot of even person to person difference with how much they sweat, depending on some of those factors. If you are more heat acclimated, you sweat more than if you're less heat acclimated. The electrolyte composition of your sweat is different, and you conserve sodium more effectively when you're heat acclimated, but you will actually increase your sweat loss rates after you've done some heat acclimation training. So lots of different stuff going on. To make it really simple, you want to be making sure that you're taking at least a few sips of fluid every 10 to 15 minutes. When you're taking a gel or you're taking an energy chew or some kind of fuel, take a little bit more when you're taking a gel. So about every 10 to 15 minutes, make sure you're just taking a few sips of your fluid. Take a little bit more when you're taking a gel. That's kind of your baseline. If you want to take it a step further and understand your sweat loss rates a little bit more, you can do a weight before and after a run. Typically, I would say a workout that's an hour or longer is a good assessment. Again, knowing this is going to be highly variable depending on whether you're running inside, outside, the weather, etc. Keeping track of, your pre and post weight, and then also making a note of how much you drank during that run. So then you're going to subtract your post weight from your pre weight and subtract your amount that you drank. Now you have a total sweat loss rate for that run. Now you could divide that by how many hours you were running, and you would have your hourly sweat loss rate. If you ran for just 1 hour, then of course you would just divide by 1, and that would be your sweat loss rate for that hour. So you can track this out over time, right? You can make a note of this over time and get a better understanding of your sweat loss rates. And so then you would know how much should you kind of be aiming to drink, or what's kind of your goal. Most people are going to have a hard time replacing their fluid losses like fully. Like, if you're losing a liter an hour of sweat, it might be hard for you to drink a liter an hour. And if you're losing more than that, then it will be very difficult to drink more than that because there are limits on how much our digestive system can absorb for fluids. But if you have that understanding, then at least you kind of know what your goal can be, what's a realistic goal, making sure you're not maybe over drinking, over hydrating if your sweat loss rates aren't that high, and kind of assessing how that plays into how thirsty you feel during those runs. Your other option, so you can do the pre and post weight. I think it's really great. It's not perfect, but nothing ever really is. The other option, and you can do this sometimes, you can also do this kind of in collaboration with your pre and post weights, looking at hydration, would be using something like the Nix biosensor to also look at your sweat loss rates and even the electrolyte composition of your sweat. And so this can be really helpful as well to understand if you are a saltier sweater or not. And again, to have a more personalized recommendation on both your fluid needs as well as your electrolyte needs. So just understanding that there is no one size fits all for how much fluid you should consume during your marathon. But of course, whatever you do on the day of the race is what you should have been practicing with. Gut training goes a long way towards increasing our ability to stay hydrated, and not being hydrated, dehydration, is a huge risk factor for GI issues during a marathon. So practicing drinking during your runs, making sure you're taking fluids with any gels or other sport foods that you're consuming. And of course, you can use tools like I said, the pre and post weights or a Nix biosensor to actually get a little bit more personalized data. And of course, tracking that over time so that when you get to the day of your race, you feel really confident and have a really good plan about what you're going to do, both for fuel as well as for hydration. All right, so that is it for today's Q&A episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed putting this one together for you guys because we got some really, really great questions in. These were all fantastic topics of discussion. I hope that you took a lot away and learned a lot during this Q&A episode. We will definitely be doing more as the season goes on. If you have any questions, if you enjoyed the episode, if you didn't enjoy the episode, of course, I would love to hear from you. You can find me over on Instagram at Steph the Runner's Dietitian, and make sure you're following along so that you can see the call out for the next Q&A. And if you do have a question that you want me to answer, you can make sure to get yours in. All right, that is it for this week's episode, and we will see you right back here next week. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.